Robert Bob Douglas lived a life far removed from the chaos of modern civilization. He had always considered himself a man of solitude, someone who found peace in the whisper of the wind through the trees and the steady hum of the river that cut through his remote mountain property. Years ago, he had deliberately turned his back on the bustling city where he'd grown up, trading the noise and clamor of urban life for the quiet isolation of his cabin deep in the wilderness. It wasn't a decision born of bitterness or some dramatic rejection of society. It was simply that the wilderness felt more like home than any city ever had. Here, on his 40 acres of rugged mountain land, he had everything he needed: his cabin, a small garden that provided fresh vegetables, a few solar panels for power, and the sturdy wooden bridge that spanned the fast-moving river and connected his home to the nearest town miles away. The bridge was more than a structure. It was a testament to his own 2 hands and determination. When he first purchased the land, there had been no way to cross the river, which surged powerfully even in the driest months. With no bridge, the property had been practically inaccessible, but that hadn't deterred him. Over the course of 2 long, grueling months, he built the bridge himself, hauling timber up the steep incline, hammering every nail, and securing each plank. By the time he finished, the bridge wasn't just functional. It was a symbol of his independence and self-reliance, a gateway to the world he had built for himself. Bob wasn't entirely cut off from civilization. Once a week, he would make the trip into town to stock up on supplies, check his mail, and occasionally indulge in a meal at the local diner, where the same faces greeted him with nods of recognition. Though he was not what anyone would call social, he enjoyed these brief interactions, just enough connection to remind him that he wasn't completely alone in the world. The townsfolk had come to know him as the quiet man from the mountains, someone who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. That expectation of privacy was what made the destruction of the bridge so shocking. It began, as most disruptions do, with something small, so small that Bob almost didn't notice it at first. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his cabin, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the light fade behind the jagged peaks, he thought he heard a faint sound over the rush of the river. It was hard to pinpoint, almost like a distant engine or a low, rhythmic buzzing. He dismissed it as nothing more than the echoes of the forest, maybe a deer rustling through the underbrush or the distant call of some nocturnal bird. By the time the sound faded entirely, it had slipped from his mind. The next morning, however, he couldn't ignore what he saw. As he approached the river on his usual path, the sight of splintered wood and jagged edges where the bridge had once stood stopped him cold. His heart sank as he stepped closer, taking in the scene with growing disbelief. The sturdy planks he had laid with such care were gone, carried downstream or shattered into the rocks below. The support beams were sliced clean through, the sharp edges telling him that this wasn't the work of natural decay or even a storm. It was deliberate. Someone had cut the bridge down. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it had been an act of vandalism by reckless teenagers. But as he inspected the area further, he found evidence that made the explanation far more sinister. Deep grooves in the earth near the base of the supports suggested the use of heavy equipment, something far beyond the capabilities of a few mischievous kids. The realization hit him with a chill. Whoever did this had come prepared. The implications of the act were unsettling. The bridge was his lifeline, the only way in and out of his property without taking a dangerous, hours-long trek through dense forest and steep terrain. Without it, he was effectively trapped. For a man who valued his independence above all else, the destruction of the bridge felt like an attack on his very way of life. Bob spent the rest of the day surveying the damage and considering his options. The most immediate concern was getting across the river to town. His supplies would last for a week or 2, but he couldn't afford to be cut off for much longer than that. He recalled an old aluminum rowboat he'd found on the property years ago, buried under a pile of debris near the riverbank. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get him across the current and into town. By the time he hauled the boat out of its hiding place, his muscles ached and his hands were raw from dragging it through the brush. The boat was battered, with patches of rust along its edges and a cracked oarlock that made it clear it hadn't been used in years. Still, it was his best option. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he secured the boat near the water's edge and decided to make the crossing first thing in the morning. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. The bridge hadn't simply collapsed, it had been destroyed, and whoever had done it had gone to great lengths to make sure it couldn't be repaired quickly. The grooves in the earth haunted him, a reminder that this wasn't random. Someone had planned this. But why? The answer didn't come to him, and the question lingered like a shadow as he drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, he rose early, fortified himself with a strong cup of coffee, and made his way down to the river. The current was swift, churning around the rocks with a ferocity that made him hesitate. For a moment he considered turning back, waiting until he could think of a better solution, but he dismissed the thought. He couldn't afford to wait. The crossing was harrowing. The boat rocked violently as he fought to keep it steady, the oars creaking under the strain. By the time he reached the opposite shore, his arms burned with exertion, and his breath came in labored gasps. But he made it. Dragging the boat onto the rocky bank, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief before beginning the long hike to town. When he arrived, the townsfolk greeted him with their usual nods and friendly waves, but he didn't stop to chat. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he explained what had happened to the bridge. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Carter who had seen his fair share of disputes and small-town drama, listened with a furrowed brow. "Sounds like someone's got a problem with you," Carter said finally, leaning back in his chair. "The question is who and why?" Bob nodded, his jaw tight. "That's what I intend to find out." As he left the sheriff's office, a woman's voice called out to him from across the street. Turning, he saw Karen Hayward, a prominent figure in the community, striding toward him with a clipboard in hand and a triumphant smirk on her face. "Well, if it isn't our mountain man," she said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "I heard about your little bridge problem. Such a shame." There was something in her expression that set Bob on edge. She looked too pleased, as if she knew more about the situation than she was letting on. "What do you want, Karen?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Oh, nothing much," she replied, her smirk widening. "Just thought you should know that your property is being reviewed for potential inclusion in the community's new park initiative. That bridge of yours? It was unsafe, you know, a hazard. The town deserves better access to its natural resources." Bob's stomach turned as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just an act of vandalism, it was the opening move in a calculated attempt to take his land, and Karen Hayward was at the center of it. Bob's heart was pounding as he stared at Karen Hayward, the self-appointed voice of the community, who stood before him with her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and her smug smile fixed firmly in place. He didn't need her to explain her intentions in detail, he could see it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself. She thought she had already won. The destruction of the bridge wasn't just about inconveniencing him or proving a point, it was part of a broader scheme, a calculated move to undermine his claim to the land and push him out entirely. Karen tilted her head slightly, as if sizing him up. "I'm sure you'll understand," she continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "The town has been looking into ways to make the natural beauty of this area more accessible to everyone. Your property is just so isolated. It would make a wonderful addition to our plans for a park and community gathering space." Bob felt his jaw tighten, his fists curling reflexively at his sides. The audacity of her words was almost enough to push him into an outright confrontation then and there. He forced himself to take a deep breath, to keep his composure. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything, it would only give her ammunition to use against him later. "This is my land," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. "I built that bridge with my own 2 hands. You have no right to come onto my property and destroy it, no matter what your so-called plans are." Karen's expression didn't waver. If anything, her smirk deepened, as though she found his resistance amusing. "Oh, I think you'll find that things aren't as clear-cut as you believe," she replied smoothly. "You see, the land records in this area are complicated, and when we reviewed them, we discovered some discrepancies. It seems that the boundaries of your property aren't quite where you thought they were." Bob's stomach churned at her words, but he refused to let her see the doubt flicker across his face. "That's ridiculous," he said sharply. "I've lived on that land for years. I've got the deed, the surveys, everything's in order." Karen raised an eyebrow, her expression one of mock surprise. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that," she said, her voice tinged with false sympathy. "But the truth is, these things can get quite messy. And if the town council decides that your land would be better used as part of the park initiative," well, she trailed off, shrugging as if the matter were out of her hands. Bob felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he clamped it down. He wasn't about to let Karen manipulate him into saying something he'd regret. Instead, he stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "You can play your games, Karen," he said coldly, "but don't think for a second that I'm going to roll over and let you take what's mine. If you want a fight, you'll get one, but don't expect me to play by your rules." For the first time, Karen's composure faltered. It was subtle, just a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it was enough to tell Bob that he had struck a nerve. She quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders and flashing him a tight smile. "Well, we'll just have to see how things play out," she said lightly, turning on her heel and walking away without another word. Bob stood there for a moment, watching her retreating figure as a sense of foreboding settled over him. He knew that this was only the beginning, that Karen wouldn't back down easily. If anything, his defiance would only make her more determined to push her agenda forward. Determined not to waste any more time, Bob headed straight to the county records office. If Karen was claiming there were discrepancies in the land boundaries, he needed to see for himself. The office was a small, stuffy building tucked away on a side street, its walls lined with shelves of dusty files and faded maps. The clerk on duty, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but indifferent. "I need to see the property records for my land," Bob said, giving her the address. "There's been some talk about boundary issues, and I want to make sure everything's in order." The clerk nodded and began typing on her computer, her fingers clicking rapidly against the keys. After a few moments, she frowned, tilting her head slightly as she studied the screen. "That's odd," she murmured. Bob's pulse quickened. "What is it?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "Well," she began hesitantly, "it looks like there have been some recent updates to the records for your property. The boundaries were redefined a few weeks ago, and a portion of the land is now listed as municipal property." Bob's stomach dropped. "That's not possible," he said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. "I never authorized any changes to the records. Who did this?" The clerk shook her head. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but it's all here in the system. If you want to dispute it, you'll need to file a formal complaint with the county office." Bob felt a wave of frustration wash over him. Filing a complaint would take weeks, if not months, and in the meantime, Karen would have free rein to push her plans forward. He needed to act quickly, but he also knew that he couldn't handle this alone. After leaving the records office, Bob made his way to a small law firm on the edge of town. The firm had a reputation for taking on tough cases, and he hoped that they could help him navigate the legal quagmire he was now facing. The lawyer he met with, a sharp-eyed woman named Lydia, listened intently as he explained the situation. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like you're dealing with a classic land grab," she said finally. "They're using legal loopholes and bureaucratic red tape to try and push you off your property. It's underhanded, but unfortunately it's not uncommon." Bob clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "What can I do to stop them?" he demanded. Lydia held up a hand, her tone calm but firm. "First, we need to gather evidence," she said. "I'll file an injunction to put a hold on any further changes to the property records. In the meantime, I need you to document everything, every conversation, every piece of correspondence, every suspicious activity you notice on your land. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be." Bob nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since this ordeal had begun. He might be up against powerful opponents, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. As he left the law firm, his mind was already racing with plans. He would set up cameras around his property to monitor any activity, reach out to his neighbors for support, and make sure that every detail of Karen's scheme was brought to light. But even as he resolved to fight back, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen had shown her hand, but he knew she wasn't working alone. There was a larger game at play, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The following morning, Bob woke up earlier than usual. The air was crisp and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth through the open window of his cabin. He took a deep breath and tried to center himself, but the events of the past few days had already begun to weigh heavily on his mind. Karen's smug face lingered in his thoughts, her words playing over and over like a broken record. Her confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was rooted in something she believed she could control. That made her more dangerous than any ordinary opportunist. He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he approached the river. What had once been a sturdy bridge was now a painful reminder of his vulnerability, a gaping absence that symbolized how quickly someone else's agenda could upend his life. The water churned below, deceptively tranquil, as though it were mocking him. For the first time in years he felt truly powerless. But there was no time to wallow in frustration. If he didn't act swiftly, Karen's plans would bulldoze everything he'd built. The aluminum rowboat he'd unearthed a few days ago rested by the riverbank, patched and ready for use again. Bob was already growing weary of relying on the flimsy craft to cross the river, but it was all he had until the matter of the bridge could be resolved. He untied the rope that anchored the boat and began the arduous process of rowing across the current, his arms straining against the resistance of the water. As he reached the far bank, he glanced back at his cabin, now isolated on the other side, and felt a pang of anger at how helpless the situation had made him. After dragging the boat ashore, he made his way toward town. His goal for the day was clear: gather the tools and resources he needed to protect his land. That meant meeting with Lydia, the lawyer who had agreed to help him, and figuring out the next steps in countering Karen's land grab. By the time he arrived at Lydia's office, his shirt was damp with sweat from the trek, but he barely noticed. Lydia greeted him with her usual sharp efficiency, gesturing for him to sit as she spread a series of documents across the desk. "I've been digging into the updated land records," she began, adjusting her glasses as she spoke. "And it's worse than we initially thought. Not only have the boundaries of your property been altered, but there's also a new filing from the local council indicating that the land is being reclassified as a public recreation zone. If that designation goes through, it will make it significantly harder to fight them in court." Bob frowned, leaning forward to examine the papers she'd laid out. The reclassification filing was dated just a few weeks prior, aligning almost perfectly with the timing of the bridge's destruction. It was clear that Karen and whoever she was working with had been planning this for months, if not longer. "Can we stop it?" he asked, his voice low but tense. Lydia nodded, though her expression was grim. "We can file an objection with the council, but we'll need to act quickly. Once the reclassification is approved, it'll be nearly impossible to reverse. I've also submitted an injunction to freeze any further changes to the property records, but it'll take time for the court to process it. Time." That was the one thing Bob didn't have. Every day that passed was another day Karen and her cronies could use to solidify their position. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What else can I do?" he asked finally, meeting Lydia's gaze. "For now, document everything," she replied. "If you see anyone on your property, take notes, take pictures, anything that could be used as evidence. And keep an eye out for anything unusual. It's clear they're willing to play dirty, so don't underestimate them." Bob nodded, though he felt a flicker of doubt. He wasn't used to relying on the legal system to solve his problems. Out here in the mountains, he'd always believed in handling things himself. But this situation was bigger than him, and he knew he couldn't fight it alone. After leaving Lydia's office, he made a few more stops in town to gather supplies: a new set of trail cameras, extra batteries, and a sturdy lock for the gate at the edge of his property, all tools he hoped would help him regain some semblance of control. By the time he started the long hike back to his cabin, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As he approached the river, something caught his eye. The boat was exactly where he'd left it, but the rope securing it to the tree had been cut clean through. A faint ripple on the surface of the water suggested that someone had recently been there. Bob's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, his eyes darting from one shadowy shape to the next. The forest around him was eerily quiet, the usual rustle of leaves and chirping of birds conspicuously absent. He crouched low, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife he kept strapped to his belt. For several tense minutes, he remained still, listening for any sign of movement. When none came, he slowly rose and approached the tree where the boat had been tied. The cut rope confirmed what he already suspected: someone had been there, and they wanted him to know it. Anger flared in his chest as he considered the implications. It wasn't enough for Karen to try and take his land through legal maneuvering. Now she was sending people to intimidate him directly. The brazenness of the act only deepened his resolve. Back at the cabin, Bob wasted no time setting up the trail cameras he'd purchased earlier. He placed them strategically along the perimeter of his property, focusing on the most likely access points. If anyone tried to come onto his land again, he'd have the evidence to prove it. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Bob spent most of his time reinforcing his defenses, securing the cabin's windows, setting up motion-activated lights, and even rigging a simple alarm system using fishing line and tin cans. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It wasn't until the fourth day that the first sign of trouble appeared. Bob was chopping firewood behind the cabin when he heard the faint hum of an engine in the distance. He set down the axe and wiped his brow, straining to locate the source of the sound. A few moments later, a black SUV emerged from the tree line, its tires crunching over the gravel path. Bob's jaw tightened as he watched it approach, his hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. The vehicle came to a stop a few yards away, and two men in dark suits stepped out. The taller of the two, a man with slick-back hair and an air of practiced arrogance, took a few steps forward and extended a hand. "Mr. Douglas, I presume," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. Bob didn't move to shake his hand. "Who's asking?" The man smiled thinly, withdrawing his hand. "My name is Richard Blake. I represent a group of local investors who are very interested in the development of this area. We understand that you've had some concerns about the recent changes to the land records." Bob crossed his arms over his chest, his expression hard. That's one way to put it. Richard chuckled lightly, as though Bob's resistance was a minor inconvenience rather than a serious obstacle. "We're here to offer a solution," he continued. "We'd like to buy your property at a very generous price, I might add. Enough to cover any expenses you might have and then some." Bob's eyes narrowed. "Not interested." Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I'd encourage you to think it over," he said, his tone softening. "This is a limited-time offer. If you refuse, we can't guarantee that the reclassification process won't move forward. Once that happens, your property will lose significant value, and you might find yourself out of options." Bob took a step closer, his voice cold. "Let me make something clear," he said. "This is my land. I'm not selling it, and I'm not going anywhere. You can take your offer and shove it." Richard's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a steely glint in his eyes. He nodded curtly, then turned and motioned for the other man to follow him back to the SUV. As they drove away, Bob felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that this was far from over. The stakes had been raised, and the first move in the escalation had been made. Now, it was up to Bob to make his next move, and he knew he couldn't afford to make a misstep. Bob sat on the porch of his cabin, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the distant rush of the river below. The tension in his chest was almost suffocating, a mix of anger, frustration, and unease that had been building ever since the two men in the black SUV had left his property a few days earlier. Their so-called offer had been nothing short of a veiled threat, a reminder that the fight for his land was far from over. He had turned them away, but he knew it wouldn't be the last he saw of them. They were too determined, too calculated. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. It wasn't in his nature to back down from a challenge, but this wasn't a simple problem he could fix with brute strength or persistence. His enemies weren't just individuals, they were part of a system, one that could twist laws and manipulate records to suit their agenda. The realization gnawed at him, but it also sharpened his resolve. They might have resources and connections, but Bob had something they didn't: an unshakable attachment to the land. As the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Bob rose from his chair and stepped inside. His cabin was simple but functional, filled with the practical comforts of a life lived deliberately. Tonight, however, the usual calm of his home felt hollow. The trail cameras he had installed along the perimeter of his property had been silent since he set them up, but that only added to his unease. The quiet wasn't reassuring, it was suspicious. The next morning, Bob woke early, as he always did. The air was cool and damp, clinging to his skin as he stepped outside to check the cameras. He had placed them strategically, covering the areas where he suspected intruders might try to gain access. It took him nearly an hour to visit each one, carefully reviewing the footage on the small display screen attached to the devices. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual images of deer wandering through the forest or birds flitting between the trees. But as he reached the last camera, his breath caught in his throat. The screen displayed a series of still images captured in the early hours of the morning. The first showed an empty stretch of path, the same as it had appeared the day before. But in the next frame, a shadowy figure was visible at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, their features indistinct, but there was no mistaking their presence. They had been there, on his property, in the dead of night. Bob felt a surge of anger as he scrolled through the rest of the footage. The figure moved cautiously, as if trying to avoid detection, but they didn't seem to realize they were being watched. In the final frame, they were captured standing near the remains of the bridge, their head tilted downward as though examining something on the ground. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The discovery left Bob seething. It wasn't enough for Karen and her associates to use legal and bureaucratic means to try to take his land. They were now resorting to covert tactics, sending people onto his property under the cover of darkness. He didn't know what they were looking for, but the fact that they had been there at all was enough to set his blood boiling. After transferring the footage to his laptop, Bob drove into town to meet with Lydia. The lawyer had been his one consistent ally throughout this ordeal, and he trusted her to help him figure out the next steps. When he arrived at her office, he found her already poring over a stack of documents, her expression one of focused determination. "I found something," he said without preamble, setting his laptop on her desk and pulling up the footage. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched the video. When it ended, she sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "This is good," she said finally. "It's proof that they're not playing by the rules. If we can connect this to Karen or her associates, it could be a major blow to their case." Bob nodded, though he felt a flicker of doubt. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked. "It's a start," Lydia replied. "But we'll need more. Surveillance footage alone won't prove their intentions, it just shows they were there. We need something concrete, something that ties them directly to the sabotage of the bridge or their attempts to manipulate the land records." Bob clenched his jaw, the frustration building again. "And how do we get that?" Lydia hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "I've been looking into the reclassification filing," she said finally. "There are some irregularities in the paperwork, dates that don't match up, signatures that look questionable. It's possible that the entire process was rushed through without proper oversight. If we can expose that, it could invalidate the filing entirely." Bob felt a glimmer of hope at her words, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their opponents wouldn't go down without a fight. Karen and her associates had already shown they were willing to bend the rules to get what they wanted. He couldn't afford to underestimate them. Over the next few days, Bob threw himself into the task of gathering evidence. He reviewed the footage from the trail cameras each morning, carefully documenting any suspicious activity. He also began reaching out to his neighbors, hoping to find someone who had seen or heard anything that could bolster his case. It was during one of these conversations that he uncovered a crucial piece of information. While speaking with an older couple who lived on the outskirts of town, Bob learned that Karen had been meeting with a group of investors in secret, holding private gatherings at a local hotel. The couple didn't know the specifics of what was discussed, but they had overheard snippets of conversation about development opportunities and expanding public access. The revelation sent a jolt through Bob. If Karen was working with investors, it explained a lot her sudden interest in his property, the reclassification filing, and the destruction of the bridge. She wasn't just trying to claim his land for a community park, she was setting the stage for a much larger project, one that would likely line her own pockets in the process. Armed with this new information, Bob returned to Lydia's office. Together, they began piecing together the puzzle, combing through public records and property filings to uncover any links between Karen and the investors. It was slow, painstaking work, but bit by bit, they started to uncover a trail of evidence, a series of transactions and agreements that painted a clear picture of Karen's true intentions. The breakthrough came late one evening, when Lydia found a document buried in the town council's archives. It was a memorandum of understanding between Karen and a real estate development firm, outlining plans for a luxury resort that would include a golf course, a spa, and high-end vacation homes. The document was dated months before the reclassification filing, proving that Karen's community park narrative had been a lie from the start. Bob felt a surge of vindication as he read the document, but it was quickly tempered by the realization of what they were up against. This wasn't just about protecting his land anymore, it was about stopping a scheme that would destroy the natural beauty of the entire area. Karen and her associates had overplayed their hand, but it would take everything he had to bring them down. The following morning, Bob filed an official complaint with the town council, attaching the memorandum and other evidence they had gathered. It was a bold move, one that would undoubtedly draw even more attention to him, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The fight for his land had become a fight for the community, and he wasn't about to back down. As he left the council office, Bob couldn't shake the feeling that the tide was beginning to turn. Karen's house of cards was starting to collapse, and he intended to be there when it all came crashing down. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one man's determination could make all the difference. Bob stood in the clearing outside his cabin, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. The forest around him was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He'd spent the last few weeks tirelessly gathering evidence and filing complaints, but the quiet of the mountains no longer brought him comfort. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow more menacing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger, more dangerous than the small-scale skirmishes he'd dealt with so far. Karen had been uncharacteristically quiet since the discovery of the memorandum linking her to the resort developers. Too quiet. Bob knew she wasn't one to retreat without a fight, and the longer she stayed silent, the more certain he became that she was planning her next move. He adjusted the strap on his trail camera as he secured it to a tree, angling the lens to cover the path leading toward his cabin. The cameras had already proven their worth, capturing footage of the mysterious figure near the ruined bridge. But now Bob wanted them to serve as an early warning system. He'd learned the hard way that Karen's people were willing to trespass, sabotage, and intimidate to achieve their goals, and he had no intention of being caught off guard again. As he finished setting up the camera, the distant rumble of an engine reached his ears. Bob froze, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife on his belt. The sound grew louder, closer, until a black pickup truck emerged from the tree line. It rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, and two men climbed out. Bob recognized one of them immediately, Richard Blake, the slick-talking man who had offered to buy his property just a few weeks earlier. The second man was stockier, with a shaved head and a menacing air that made Bob's hackles rise. "Mr. Douglas," Richard called out, his tone smooth and condescending. "Fancy seeing you out here." Bob didn't respond right away. He finished securing the camera and turned to face them, his expression cold and unyielding. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Richard spread his arms in a gesture of mock friendliness. "We're just here to have a chat," he said. "No need to be hostile." Bob crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing. "I've got nothing to say to you." Richard chuckled, as though Bob's defiance amused him. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear this," he said. "You see, we've been very patient with you, Mr. Douglas. We've given you every opportunity to resolve this matter amicably. But you've made it clear that you're not interested in cooperating." Bob's jaw tightened. If by cooperating you mean letting you and Karen steal my land, then yeah, I'm not interested. The stocky man took a step forward, his posture aggressive. You're making a mistake, he growled, his voice low and threatening. Bob's hand hovered near the knife on his belt, but he didn't draw it. You've got 5 seconds to get off my property, he said, his voice like steel. Richard sighed, shaking his head as though Bob had disappointed him. There's no need for this to get ugly, he said, but if you're determined to play hardball, I'll remind you that we're not without our own resources. You might want to think twice before crossing us. Bob didn't respond. He simply stared them down, his silence more intimidating than any threat. After a tense moment, Richard nodded to the other man, and they climbed back into the truck. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared back into the forest, leaving Bob alone once again. Despite his outward calm, Bob felt a surge of unease as he watched them go. The encounter had been brief, but it carried an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. Richard wasn't bluffing when he said they had resources, and Bob had no doubt that they would use them to escalate the conflict. That night, Bob double-checked every lock, every window, every camera. He slept fitfully, his dreams filled with dark figures moving through the forest, their intentions unknown but unmistakably hostile. When he woke in the early hours of the morning, he felt as though he hadn't rested at all. The first sign of trouble came later that day. Bob had been out repairing a section of the fence along the edge of his property when he noticed something odd, a small, unmarked drone hovering just above the treetops. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a drone near his land, but this one seemed different. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were scanning the area. Bob grabbed his binoculars and focused on the device, noting its sleek, high-tech design. He had no doubt it was being operated by Karen's people, likely as part of an effort to gather intelligence on him. The realization sent a surge of anger through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Destroying the drone would be satisfying, but it would also give Karen ammunition to use against him. Instead, he made a mental note of its appearance and continued about his work, pretending not to notice its presence. Over the next few days, the drone sightings became more frequent. It was clear that Karen and her associates were ramping up their efforts, but Bob refused to let them intimidate him. He focused on fortifying his property, setting up additional cameras, and even laying down spikes on some of the less traveled paths to deter unwanted visitors. But the most brazen act of aggression came one night when Bob was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. He bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding as he grabbed the shotgun he kept by his side. The sound had come from the front of the cabin, and as he crept toward the door, he could see the faint flicker of light through the window. When he stepped outside, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail at the cabin, setting fire to a section of the porch. The flames licked hungrily at the wood, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Bob acted quickly, grabbing a bucket of water and dousing the flames before they could spread. As he surveyed the damage, his mind raced. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a direct attack. Karen and her associates had crossed a line, and Bob knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to take the fight to them. The next morning, he drove into town to meet with Lydia, his jaw set with determination. When he explained what had happened, she was visibly alarmed. "This changes everything," she said. "We need to bring this to the authorities. Arson is a serious crime, and it shows just how far they're willing to go." Bob nodded. "Do you think the sheriff will actually do something about it?" he asked, his skepticism evident. Lydia hesitated, then said, "I'll make sure he takes it seriously. But in the meantime, we need to stay one step ahead of them. I've been digging into Karen's financial records, and I think I've found something that could turn the tide in our favor." She explained that Karen had been funneling money from the development project into a series of offshore accounts, likely to avoid detection. The transactions were suspicious enough to raise red flags, and Lydia believed they could use the information to undermine Karen's credibility. Bob felt a glimmer of hope at her words, but it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of the situation. The fight was far from over, and he knew that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a real chance of turning the tables. As he left Lydia's office, his resolve hardened. The escalation of the conflict had pushed him to his limits, but it had also revealed the lengths Karen and her allies were willing to go to. Bob knew he couldn't let them win, not just for himself, but for everyone who valued the untouched beauty of the mountains. The battle was intensifying, and Bob was ready to face it head-on. The early morning fog clung stubbornly to the mountain as Bob stood on his porch, surveying the damage from the arson attack days earlier. The burn marks on the wooden planks were a stark reminder of just how far Karen and her associates were willing to go. His fists clenched involuntarily at the thought of the sheer audacity it took to invade his home with such recklessness. But instead of fear, he felt a steely determination harden inside him. This was no longer just about protecting his land, it was about standing up to the kind of ruthless, entitled arrogance that believed it could trample over anyone who got in its way. Bob had spent the last few days preparing. After consulting with Lydia and turning over evidence of the arson to the sheriff, he'd focused on reinforcing his property. The cameras were repositioned to cover blind spots, the perimeter traps were reset, and his legal case against Karen was steadily building momentum. The memorandum they'd found linking her to the developers was now at the center of the strategy. Lydia was crafting a strategy designed to not only expose Karen's lies but to dismantle her entire operation. But Karen was not one to wait idly for her plans to be disrupted. That morning, Bob's preparations were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of vehicles rumbling up the dirt road that led to his property. He grabbed his binoculars and peered through the treetops, spotting 3 black SUVs crawling toward the clearing. They moved deliberately, almost like a convoy. His gut told him this wasn't a friendly visit. When the SUVs finally pulled up, a group of people emerged. Richard Blake was at the forefront, his smug smile as infuriating as ever. Beside him was Karen herself, dressed impeccably as though she were attending a gala, rather than trespassing on someone else's land. Behind them were several men, all wearing dark suits that looked strangely out of place in the rugged wilderness. Bob stepped out onto his porch, his shotgun slung over his shoulder in plain view. He didn't raise it, but he made sure they noticed. The air was thick with tension as the group approached, stopping just short of the steps leading up to his cabin. Mr. Douglas, Karen began, her voice dripping with mock civility. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation, don't you?" Bob didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, watching her squirm ever so slightly before finally speaking. "I've got nothing to say to you, Karen. Whatever you want, the answer is no." Karen sighed theatrically, as though he were an unruly child refusing to listen to reason. Now, there's no need to be so hostile," she said. "We're here to offer you one last chance to resolve this amicably. Sell your land, take the very generous payout we've prepared for you, and walk away with your dignity intact." Bob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "And if I don't?" Karen's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Then you'll leave us no choice but to escalate," she said. "You've already seen what happens when you refuse to cooperate. This is your chance to avoid further complications." Bob took a step closer, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden planks. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice like granite. "This is my land. I'm not selling it, I'm not giving it up, and I'm damn sure not letting you or anyone else push me around. So if you think you can scare me off, you're wasting your time." Karen's expression hardened, her mask of civility slipping just enough to reveal the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're making a mistake," she said coldly. "We'll see about that," Bob shot back. Karen turned on her heel and marched back toward the SUVs, motioning for her entourage to follow. As they drove away, Bob felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but he also knew the confrontation wasn't over, it was only the beginning. That evening, Lydia called with an update. "We've got them," she said, her excitement barely contained. The sheriff finally agreed to issue a search warrant for Karen's financial records. If we can prove she's been laundering money through her development deals, it'll blow her case apart. Bob allowed himself a small smile. It was the first real victory they'd had in weeks, and it gave him hope that justice might still prevail. But Lydia's tone grew serious as she continued. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "I've been digging into the developers Karen's working with, and they're not just local players. They're part of a much larger corporation with a reputation for using strong-arm tactics to get what they want. If they're involved, this could get even messier. Bob's smile faded. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only deepened his resolve. "Let them come," he said simply. The following night, the escalation came to a head. Bob was in his cabin reviewing footage from the trail cameras when the alarm he'd rigged up near the perimeter went off. He grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The moonlight illuminated a group of figures near the tree line, at least 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothing and moving with military precision. Bob's heart pounded as he raised the shotgun, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, and the figures froze. "You're on private property," he shouted. "Turn around and leave, or the next one won't be a warning." For a moment it seemed like they might retreat, but then one of them stepped forward, raising what looked like a handheld device. Bob didn't wait to find out what it was. He fired again, this time aiming low to avoid serious injury, and the group scattered into the trees. When the sheriff arrived the next morning to investigate, Bob showed him the footage from the cameras. The sheriff's expression grew graver with each passing minute. "These aren't just hired thugs," he said finally. "They're professionals. Whoever sent them wasn't just trying to scare you, they were trying to make a statement." The evidence was damning enough to force the sheriff's hand. Later that day, he personally delivered the search warrant to Karen's office. The investigation that followed uncovered a web of corruption and illegal activity that reached far beyond the small mountain town. Karen had been funneling money from the developers into offshore accounts, bribing local officials to push through the reclassification of Bob's land, and using intimidation tactics to silence anyone who stood in her way. When Karen was arrested, the look of shock and fury on her face was almost enough to make up for everything Bob had endured. Almost. The battle for his land had taken a toll on him, and while the victory was sweet, it was also bittersweet. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be people like Karen, willing to destroy anything in their path for the sake of power and profit. But for now, at least, Bob could breathe a little easier. His land was safe, and Karen's empire was crumbling around her. As he stood on the rebuilt bridge, looking out over the river that had always been his sanctuary, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The mountains were his home, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The morning after Karen's arrest, Bob stood on the edge of his property, staring out over the river as the sun began its slow ascent over the horizon. The crisp mountain air carried with it a strange sense of stillness, a quiet that felt heavier than before. For months he had fought to protect his land, enduring sabotage, intimidation, and outright attacks. Now, with Karen behind bars and her entire scheme laid bare for the world to see, he should have felt victorious. And yet, something inside him remained unsettled. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the newly rebuilt bridge, tracing the fresh grain beneath his fingertips. It had taken time to get it standing again, even after the courts had ruled in his favor. The process had been slow and frustrating, a painful reminder of how easily something essential could be ripped away and how long it took to put it back together. But despite everything, the bridge stood once more, stronger than before. Word of Karen's downfall had spread fast. It wasn't just the local sheriff who had been forced to act. The state authorities had stepped in once the full extent of her corruption had been revealed. The illegal land grabs, the financial fraud, the offshore accounts filled with development money siphoned from the town, every detail had come crashing down like a landslide, burying her and everyone who had helped her. Her closest associates, including Richard Blake, had gone into hiding, but Bob suspected it was only a matter of time before they were tracked down. Men like Richard thrived on control, but they didn't do well in the face of real consequences. Bob had testified during the hearings, laying out everything he had experienced: the destruction of his bridge, the trespassing, the harassment, and the final escalation that had nearly cost him his home. Sitting in that courtroom, facing Karen for what he knew would be the last time, he had expected to feel anger, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, he had felt nothing at all. She had looked different, the polished confidence stripped away, replaced by something hollow and desperate. She had tried to defend herself, to claim that she had been acting in the town's best interest, but the weight of the evidence had crushed her excuses before they could gain traction. Now, standing on his land, Bob took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, letting the past weeks settle behind him. He had won. His home was his again, and Karen was no longer a threat. But the fight had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had once believed that isolation would be enough to keep the world at bay. The town had changed too. The people who had once been indifferent to his struggles had begun to see the cracks in the system they had ignored for so long. A new council had been formed, made up of people who had grown sick of the corruption that had festered under Karen's rule. They had come to him after the trial, offering their apologies, their promises to do better. Bob had listened, nodding in the right places, but he hadn't decided yet if he believed them. Lydia had urged him to take an active role in the town's recovery. "You've already done more for this community than anyone else," she had said over coffee a few days ago. "You should have a say in what happens next." Bob had scoffed at the idea. He wasn't a politician, and he had no interest in sitting through endless meetings filled with empty words. But as the days passed, the idea had started to settle in his mind. Maybe it wasn't about politics. Maybe it was about making sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. His thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see a familiar truck pulling up the path. Lydia. She stepped out, looking as sharp as ever, a file folder tucked under her arm. "Figured I'd find you out here," she said, walking up to stand beside him. "You avoiding my calls?" Bob smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Just thinking." Lydia handed him the folder. "This is everything we have on the remaining land disputes Karen was involved in. There are at least 6 other families she tried to push out, not counting yours. Most of them didn't have the resources to fight back like you did." Bob flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. He had suspected that he wasn't the only one Karen had targeted, but seeing it laid out so plainly made his blood boil all over again. These weren't just names on a page, they were people who had been bullied, manipulated, and threatened the same way he had. Some had already lost their land. Others were still in limbo, waiting to see if the legal process would restore what had been taken from them. Lydia watched him carefully. "I know you probably just want to put this behind you," she said. "But I also know you well enough to realize that you're not going to let this slide." Bob let out a long breath, staring out over the river. "What do you need from me?" Lydia smiled, knowing she had already won. "Your testimony was what finally got the sheriff to act. If you're willing to speak up again, we might be able to push for full restitution for the other victims. You could help make sure this never happens again." Bob considered her words carefully. He had spent so long trying to keep the world at arm's length, but now the world had forced its way into his life whether he had wanted it to or not. Maybe it was time he stopped pretending he could fight alone. He nodded once, a silent agreement. Lydia looked satisfied. "Good," she said. "You know, you're starting to sound like someone who actually cares about this town." Bob chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't push your luck." As Lydia drove away, Bob remained where he was, staring at the land that had nearly been stolen from him. The fight wasn't over, not completely. But now he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for something bigger, something worth protecting. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The mountains were still his home, but now, maybe, the town was too.